Episode 26 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff, as well as principal football analytics, data scientist, engineer, consultant, slash overall badass, Sean Clement. Sean, the three of us are finally in a podcast together. You're there visiting Atlanta wearing what I can only describe as an amazing t-shirt. Welcome, guys.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me. And of course, I had to represent the brand as we're around here in Atlanta and getting the office set up and getting our footprint established. It's been a good trip.
One of the things you did not add, of all things, by the way, this guy beside me, to the right of me, or whatever it is to the left of you, Black Hawk extraordinaire, right? So military guy, West Point guy. So comes to the table with a lot of badassness on top of, being a badass data scientist. So we got, just so everyone knows, we have unbelievable intelligence here and unbelievable intelligence on the other side of the screen with a PhD in mathematics. And man, I'm just along for the ride. I'm hoping that I can just add a little bit.
You have such humility, Thomas, for a guy that was an NFL general manager for 12 years, two-time exec of the year, Super Bowl rings, built 2 championship caliber Atlanta teams. Let's not let the listenership forget that. But we before we get into the kind of items for today, we're not going to preview the Super Bowl as much as next week when Thomas and I are in Glendale for the Super Bowl. A little bit of an announcement here. Parker Fleming and Tage Seth, 2 of our newer hires on basically my side of the business, longtime podcast hosts. They are going to sub for us both Monday and Wednesday next week, while Thomas and I are doing things like the Jim Rome show, as well as the Ross Tucker podcast and the hopefully the Rich Eisen show, and all these great things that my good friend who listens to the show, loves the show, Matt Stofsky, was able to book for us next week. So we are going to, instead of trying to do 80 things at once, we're going to delegate. We're going to be good managers, and we're going to delegate to Parker and Tage for that podcast next week. But for now, so not only do you guys get Sean this week, you get Parker and Tage, a little bit of an influx there. But for those of you that are new to the show, we welcome you. For those of you that have listened for forever, like Darius, who said he's finally made it back to a live show again. We really thank you. Please do us a favor, like the podcast if you're watching it on YouTube. If you're listening to it on one of the podcast platforms, go ahead and rate and review. Hopefully, if you have a question for the show, the easiest way to do it is to write an Apple Podcast review. We'll read that on the show, but we really appreciate all of you for stopping by. Thomas here has left for a little bit of a thing here, so it's just going to be me and Sean. Sean, when you saw that Tom Brady retired, Tom, by the way, won Super Bowl rings with our friend Thomas over there. Tom Brady retires. What was the first thing that went through your head?
I think, like a lot of people, I double checked the Twitter account, making the announcement to make sure that it wasn't a fake. I wasn't getting duped, and yeah, it's really an end of an era, regardless of how you feel about Tom Brady and whether you're you have been a fan or you've worked in the front office or with a team that has faced Tom Brady. I think there's a lot of mutual respect there. My proudest moment working with the Ravens was probably the very first Ravens home game I went to against the New England Patriots. Last time that Brady played at M&T Bank as a Patriot against the Ravens, and was really, a coming out game for Lamar Jackson at that point. But beating Tom Brady was a huge, fist pump in the air moment. And that says a lot, right? Because the guy is just so accomplished, has been so good for so many years.
Yeah, let's actually, this is a graph that we put on Sumer Sports, at Sumer Sports on Twitter, which, by the way, you can listen to the podcast on that as well. You can listen to it later on it as well, but this was posted. This is Tom Brady's expected points added. So just to kind of, educate those who are more on the scouting and, team development side, expected points added is basically this thing that takes football, which we normally denominate in yards and touchdowns, it breaks it down and as points on every single play. So for example, you a 3rd down and 7, if you throw an 8-yard pass, that's going to be worth more points than if you throw an 8-yard pass on 3rd down and 11. And so this quantifies it. And of course, you don't need a graph to know how great Brady is, right? Like at some point, if you win 7 Super Bowls, you're more than good enough to be in the GOAT discussion. But, for example, if you look at his 2007 season, we're talking about a guy that added about 12.5 points per game to his team, or 0.4 expected points per pass. You've seen, what I love most about Brady, and Thomas, maybe you could talk about this as far as somebody who knows him. We see big peaks here, and we see some consistency, but we also see valleys, and we see valleys that he has overcome numerous times. And what kind of player does it take to have what I would consider to be 3 Hall of Fame careers wrapped in one?
Wow. I mean, let me just start by saying, no, he's always been one of those guys that when you're around him on the field, in the locker room, in the building, his presence is the way his presence is. And I know that, his ex-wife and he are pretty people, and there's a lot of people that are agitated with him for other reasons. One of the most very competitive people I've ever been around. And that's the starting point. When you're talking about quarterbacks, man, those guys that will compete to the very end, it's one of the very fortunate things we felt we had with Matt Ryan. And you've seen it with a lot of the great quarterbacks, right? There's something at the core that starts with their competitiveness. Can I tell a little story quickly about 16? So in 2016, as everyone knows, we were playing against, my old team with Bill Belichick at the helm and Tom Brady playing as he was. We were winning at halftime, as everyone knows. Going into the 3rd quarter, we get to the 4th quarter, and obviously tides change. And I look back on that often, and I think the very reason I was a general manager had everything, or not everything, a lot to do with how we did in New England with Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, right? So I get there by the virtue of their successes and Tom's successes. And that very guy who helped me get there was a very guy who really, I know he may not want to hear this, and I like Tom a lot. He led to my demise and ultimately my firing, because in the end, people often ask me, and I don't know if the answer is, if you guys would have won in 16, would Arthur have kept you in 20? I don't know that. What I do know is we did not win a Super Bowl during my time there. And that's a tough thing to swallow. And it's because when we were on the sideline, I remember sitting beside Arthur Blank, and we were coming down. It was overtime. And that coin goes in the air, and I'm not being melodramatic, and it's flipping. And I'm like, if this thing goes Tom Brady's way, I would never admit this to anyone, but we are screwed. And that thing came down on in their favor. And I thought, oh no. And sure as it was, he played the way he did. And my point on him, he is a winner. And we talked about quarterbacks before. Those guys that can pull it out in the very end, right? You can see guys out there with all kinds of athleticism and quickness and movement to throw and big guns. But the guys who finish, the guys who are there when it is, nut cutting time, so to speak, that's a Tom Brady. And that's why the guy is the best ever in my mind.
Yeah. And it's and it's an interesting question. We'll probably get to that a little bit in the offseason when, I think you have a lot of, empathy is maybe the wrong word, but you can relate, I think, a little bit to somebody like Brandon Beane in Buffalo, where, you make decisions to win that first Super Bowl that maybe a team that has won one, like you would imagine that your decision-making in subsequent years to 16 would have been different if you had gotten home in 16, and because it's just sort of the nature of it. But, that would be a different discussion point for a different time. But, Brady was, we think about, obviously, Sean, your favorite, the team that you grew up rooting for, the Seahawks, snipes them at the end of that Super Bowl. Yeah. The other Super Bowls, he kind of had a lead for most of them, or came back and won by a field goal. But, he was just, as you said, Thomas, there's just that finisher element to him that is, you can't describe really. And it's like every single person, like me as a Chiefs fan, like I have a Super Bowl that we could have won, and Brady came in and knocked the Chiefs off. And it's like, he just transcended everything. And I don't think that there's going to be a guy in the NFL that wins that many rings again. I just foresee it mathematically, Sean, as being improbable.
Well, what I think is really interesting too, like, and you saw this a little bit in the graphic, right? There's really only there's 1 year from EPA per play, and I think you could debate this using other metrics, where Brady was the undisputed best quarterback in football. And what's funny is to look back on the rhetoric of Tom Brady's career. Early in his career, it's like, okay, well, it's like, oh, Brady's, he's not as good as Peyton Manning. And then Aaron Rodgers ascends. It's like, oh, well, maybe Rodgers is the guy and Brady's second best. Like even if you grant all those arguments as true, the guy was the second best quarterback across 3 eras of fantastic quarterback play across Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, and now Patrick Mahomes, right? Like, I mean, you'd give your right leg as a GM to have the second best quarterback for 1 5-year stint, and he did it for like 2 decades.
Yeah, and in a weird way, like very unselfish in terms of what he took cap-wise. I know that's a little bit overblown at times, but he did a really good. I mean, one of the interesting things before we move on to the head coaching stuff is from 2012 to 2022 this year, every single Super Bowl except for the one Thomas talked about with Atlanta and New England included a team that built their roster around a quarterback on rookie deal money, right? Mm-hmm. There's a couple like edge cases like the 2020 Chiefs and the 2015 Panthers, but like those quarterbacks were still making the money that was at the tail end of their rookie deal. This year, obviously you have Hurts and, the Eagles optimizing that. What makes that statistic even crazier is from 2012 to 2022, Brady was in the Super Bowl in 2014, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2020. So he was the other side of that coin, and his salary demands or lack thereof were one of the reasons why he was also included in all those Super Bowls. So he just and I think about just the legacy there, and like obviously there's so many people that have walked through, including you, Thomas, the Patriot doors and have experienced winning championships. And he's one of the big reasons. And, it's so crazy that there's this humongous tree now, in the NFL that has been born out of brilliant head coach, brilliant people beneath him like you and Scott, and obviously a great quarterback that was there sort of transcending all the changes at coordinator and all the changes at the rest of the team. And it really is, I think people will talk about the Patriots for, probably for all the way until the end of time, given how improbable their run was.
Well, to that point, and I've said this before, I don't believe on our show, but there's something special about the Patriot paradigm, of course, at a lot of levels. When things were really rocking there through the 2000s and all the way up until recently, my sharing of information was as a building, as an organization with Bill at the helm, of course, and Mr. Kraft, who's a great owner, of course. Everyone in that organization, for the most part, believed that they might not have worn it on their sleeves, but they really believed that they were the damn best at what they did. All the way from the grounds crew guy, all the way through the equipment people, to the personnel directors, to the head coaches. They all had this presence about them. No one could go toe-to-toe with them. There's an amazing confidence element. We see it with Tom Brady, right? But to see it with people across the board, some people in the league hated it, right? They found it arrogant. Every time the Patriots were winning, we would go, speaking of the Senior Bowl, because it's Senior Bowl time, and everyone would be like, oh, okay, here are the Patriots again, walking around, like they have it all figured out. And quite honestly, we probably, or Bill and Scott during that time, probably had it more figured out than anyone, for any stretch of time. So, and Tom was at the core at that way, in my mind. And it's just amazing to see, retiring. Is this a real retirement? I haven't been reading it all today. Is it legit retirement or is it?
Well, so far.
I think it's legitimate, man. Like, when I saw the look on, and look, he's older than me by like a decade. Well, not a decade, but almost a decade. Like I saw the look on his face in that playoff game, and I'm like, man, he looks worn out. And like, I think, you guys probably understand. I mean, you as being in the Army, Sean, but like also Thomas, you do a lot of physical, and when I decided to leave college after 3 years because I wanted to go to grad school, but also part of the reason was the idea of spending a whole spring doing training for football and then an entire summer doing training for football. Like, I think when you're as diabolical as Tom is and your training is so regimented and so out of this world, the idea of not wanting to do that for 8 months, again, like, and you saw it a little bit, like he left training camp early to spend time with his family and stuff. And it was just like that little edge went away and you could see a decline in his play. Like, I just think when he looks at something like that and he's like, to be Tom Brady requires so much work that, if he's not 100% in, it's just not going to work. And I think that that's, why he's probably done for, because, for a player like him with the preparation that it takes to relent on that at all is going to cut into his edge to a level that's just too substantial. So, speaking of edge, okay, I want to talk about the Broncos, right? Thomas, you made an excellent point on this podcast. You were very predictive a couple of shows ago when you said that Sean Payton would relish the opportunity to go and coach the Denver Broncos. You were absolutely right. He ended up going for what amounted to a first-round pick and a swap of a second and a third in a subsequent year. So basically a first-round pick and change. That was a little bit under what we had said, but Payton costs more per year than we had said. And Payton's probably not the 10 out of 10 coach. He's probably more like a 9 out of 10. You speak about the Patriots, Thomas, as being a team that everybody hates. And now that team is Kansas City, right? Like, everybody kind of is annoyed with the Chiefs and wants them kind of knocked off their pedestal. This Broncos team has not beaten Kansas City since they won the Super Bowl in 2016 in one game, let alone win the division. You made a great point, Thomas, that Payton wants this challenge, the challenge of the reclamation project of Russell Wilson, the reclamation project of this Broncos just entire thing. And the edge that the Broncos have is this coach is going to cost a lot of money to reclaim the brilliance of Russell Wilson. But the Waltons have the most money out of any ownership group in the entire league. And so they're using it here.
Well, look, we said this in that a couple episodes ago. I also stated a guy like Sean Payton at 59. I don't want to make sure that I'm very clear about this. Not that I'm thinking his passion for football isn't wavering at all, not saying that. But these guys are thinking about their empire. They are thinking, and now they have an ownership. And we'll get into this with Dan Quinn when you ask me questions about why I thought Dan, potentially pulled out of the operation or the selection process. But staying with Sean Payton, I believe Sean Payton is one of the very few, if not the only one, that could go in there and work with Russell the way that he's going to work with him. And also remember this, and I don't know if you remember in our discussion, what Sean Payton does, which a lot of coaches can't do, he does not care about what his assistant coaches feel about him or the players to a certain degree, right? They all care. But if he has to press people, his assistant coaches, if they're not doing the right thing, or his players, you better damn well believe he's going to do it. That's a special thing. There are certain head coaches out there that are always worried about how they're perceived, as tough as they are, right? And this guy won't care about that. He'll care about being the right coach. And again, there are some people that don't like his style. I get that. Everyone's styles are different, but this is a special opportunity for him to go in there. And I don't know of any other coaches, and I'm going to put my pump in here for Dan Quinn. I think Dan might have been able to do it because Dan had his background with Russell at Seattle. Right. Russell's going to be a complicated situation for whoever goes in there, even Sean Payton. And I was going to say this, and we can continue to talk about this. I would love to talk more about George and management. If we could segue into that, if you want to come back to me on that, because there is plenty to talk about. That is a really, really complicated and again, I use multi-layered, but there's just so many elements to that build and making the choice. Think about what's on his plate. We talk about legacy for Sean Payton. Think about George Payton right now and what he's thinking about. He is thinking about his legacy. He's, we had to fire his first head coach. He had to, he has a situation with Russell Wilson on the money, and he's saying to his owner, probably, I'm not answering for him. I would say, I'm human. Yes, I want to win games. I also want to not be, a big dud that came into Denver and moved on and spent all this money. He says, look, let's spend more money to get us out of this sort of a little bit of a bind, or more than a little bit of a bind, meaning a guy that can take care of it. If that's 15 million versus 20 million, what numbers came out? Did you guys hear on Sean? Did they talk about
I haven't heard any official reports yet, but like to your point, Thomas, like this, for the people who are watching, like this is a graph that we tweeted out at Sumer Sports. It basically looked at, or a chart, which looked at basically what the preseason market win totals look like for the Saints versus how they perform. So, Payton joined right after Hurricane Katrina at the same time as Drew Brees talking about a team that was really down in the dumps, right? They had, had some positivity under Jim Haslett, but it really, had atrophied a lot. And he comes in and he has gone over or met market expectations for the Saints in all but 2 seasons since 2009, right? And so when I look at this, I think about, that 2021 year, you're talking about Jameis Winston, Trevor Siemian, and Taysom Hill, our friend Paul Saban's favorite player, and you win 9 games in an NFC that has Tampa Bay and it has Green Bay in it, and you go 11 or more wins 4 straight years, and every single one of those years the market sort of doubted you. In 2017, the market said they were going to be a 500 team. They go 11-5. In 2018, 9.5 wins. They go 13 wins, and so he just constantly overcomes expectations. Sean, do you think that last year Denver had a market win total of 10 wins? They go well under that. When we look at expectations now, where would you put that price at, Sean?
I mean, so I think there's even another layer to this in the chart that you have in front of us here, Eric, where you look at, okay, well, where did he meet and exceed expectations? He being Sean Payton. Not only did he meet or exceed them, but 25% of the time, so 1 out of every 4 seasons, he beats his preseason win total by 3 wins or more. Like 3 wins can be the difference between not making the playoffs and the number 1 seed in the right year. Like that is such a huge overachievement. And then if you look at how the Broncos, performed this year, I believe they lost every single 1-score game they were in. If they had averaged I believe it was 19 points per game. No. They end up, fighting for a wild card spot. So, when you talk about regression to the mean from a statistical point of view, or if you talk about, what can a coach do to maximize Russell Wilson from an evaluation standpoint, if they can get Russell Wilson just back to average, if they can just get that offense just back to average, there's such an upside for this team. And I think that Sean Payton has shown throughout his career that even when he's fighting up against, really good teams, and I'm sure, Thomas, you experienced this even at your highs in 2016, the Saints are a pain in the butt team to play against. And that's such an underrated piece of this whole thing. And I will give, honestly, I'll give the Denver front office a huge shout out on what they did, because, they traded a ton of draft capital for Russell Wilson. They immediately extended him. And then they come out this season and, the record kind of shows that they laid an egg. But what did they do? They had an aging pass rusher coming up on, I believe, Chubb's 3rd contract. So he's on the last year of his 2nd contract. They flip him to Miami for a 1st-round pick. And that 1st-round pick becomes Sean Payton, of course, with the swap of seconds. So you had a team that had no 1st-round draft capital whatsoever for multiple years, and they still found a way out of this hole because they were creative with looking at, who are my aging players? What can I get on the market? Sell to a team that views themselves either as a contender or as a fringe playoff team to maximize value, and turn that around and immediately pull themselves out of that hole.
Well, pulling themselves out of the hole, if you don't mind, very quickly, I mean, this is not just about everyone wanting Sean Payton. I mean, Sean looks at that organization. We talked about it from an owner standpoint, but I do want to take the opportunity to talk about George Payton, right? So I've said this before. George is very well respected around the league, and head coaches, we'll get into this with Dan, they look at the entire environment, right, when they're going, especially as a 59-year-old who's been wildly successful and is going to be making $20+ million a year probably. They're going to look at the entire setting, not only the players. They're going to look at who is my partner going to be and how is that partner setup going to be. We've heard recently, and I don't know if it's been confirmed. Remember, everyone, we talk about final 53 for GMs, right? Final 53 is basically final football say. In the very end, if you had 2 linebackers left and a GM wanted one and the head coach wanted the other, whoever has final 53 gets to pick that guy. You have to have someone with that. I think Sean's going to come in and know that George right now does not have final 53. I think that's how it's been. Sean is not, George Payton. I think they're both reporting. That's a really interesting thing that's going to be playing out. Look, that he'll have a really good relationship with George. And that's what Sean had. I know people that know Sean really well. Of course, I know him through the years. He wants someone that he can work side by with. He did it with Mickey Loomis well. And I think at the next stop, it's going to be important for him.
Well, do you think that Payton, because like we talk about the difference between offensive head coaches and defensive head coaches, and like, you know, for the offensive guy, you have so much more control because you can, you know, work with the quarterback more intimately and like help build that up. Because ultimately, when you trade what they traded for Russell Wilson, you expect Wilson to elevate the rest of the roster, right? You expect him to be what Matt was for you guys, and what Pat Mahomes is for the Chiefs, and what Brady was for the New England Patriots for so many years, and now the Bucks. And that was not the case. And now Payton is brought in, and all that money and all those resources are being brought in outside the salary cap, which is important, outside the salary cap to do that for Russ. Do you think that when you, like, with respect to Dan Quinn had an amazing season this year, following up a great season the season before, do you think, you know, do you think that bar, like that's an unreasonable bar to expect a coach to go over? Even Sean Payton, I would say, you know, respectfully, like, I think Payton's an underdog to do that, because I think every coach is an underdog to do that, save, you know, maybe Belichick, right?
Right.
When you're Dan Quinn and you say, okay, is this going to be the place where I want to get my second job, when this is what I have to overcome? I think the competitive juices would say, hell yeah, I want to do it. But realistically, was that what went through his, like, I'm sort of thinking about if I was in Dan Quinn's shoes, what would I think about the Denver job? And is that one of the reasons why it didn't come to fruition for him? Because he was certainly good enough to be a head coach next year, and it just didn't work out. Like, what, you know, is that what goes in the calculus a little bit, Thomas?
No question. I mean, look, when coaches sit down, especially in their second go around, first one for sure, they're not as, in the first gig, they're not as concerned about it, right? They'll take what they can take. It's amazing going into your second, you know, gig, if you're truly, you really narrow it down and you start looking at all elements of the organization. Ownership, of course, what your report structure is going to be. Of course, you're going to look at the players and everything like that. But you really, I mean, I don't know how many times I've had these conversations with head coaches that become head coaches that are buddies of mine, or coordinators who become head coaches. You know, Thomas, what do you think about this GM? What's his personality? What is it? What are his expectations as far as me, head coach, involvement in picking players? Because there are certain head coaches and GMs that go side by together, and they talk about players all the time. That was Dan Quinn, by the way. Dan was a personnel guy at the core. He was as a coach, right? That's really important. If you're going into a spot where you have a really heavy-handed GM who comes from a system where the head coach was a sidebar when it came to personnel, that can weigh against Dan Quinn, because Dan loves personnel. Mm-hmm. He has a very good relationship with George Payton. In the end, if Dan's stepping, I don't want to speak for Dan, but if Dan's stepping back and looking at all the opportunities, and he's saying, wow, how is this going to play out in Denver? Last year, you know, George decided not to go Dan's way, right? He's back in the hopper again, thinking he might have an opportunity. And then there's this big cat there, whether you like it or not, Sean Payton. Is that who you're going to be competing with? And no one wants to be the second, right? And we've all been there before. We've been the second or third or fifth. Man, I think I was the eighth when I was picked as a GM with Arthur. I've said that many times, and I took it on, but it's not the best feeling, right? When you know that you're not the sole choice, you know, especially in your second deal. So I think Dan, looking at all these other places, then he has to look at, you know, does he really want that situation the way that it's playing out? You know, with Jim Irsay, maybe he does, but maybe he doesn't. You know, what's going on down in Phoenix? I think he looks at all these things, guys, and he's like, wow, I'm in a great spot. They're paying me top of the market. I mean, those guys, the top of the market now at the coordinators are between $4, $8, and $5 million a year as a coordinator.
That's GM money, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
that's GM money. That's good GM money.
Yeah.
By the way. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so like, that's such a good point to say, like, you know, and you, I think you hit the nail on the head. And this brings me to Houston, right? Like with Demico Ryans, where, and there's extra elements to there because Demico Ryans was a Houston Texan draft pick, and he was I think he's Ring of Honor. I don't know. He might be eventually, but Demico Ryans has not been a coordinator for that long, let alone a head coach before. and he goes, Sean, to Houston, gets a long-term deal there, which is a good thing, because we saw with David Culley, we saw with Lovie Smith, Houston bailed on 2 coaches early, and again, this is not a trivial matter either. 2 African American coaches bailed on them, a year in each one. So Demico Ryans gets the security there for a franchise that has the second pick, that is still rebuilding. And so for him, he sort of can't be as selective, right? Because he hasn't done that before. He hasn't made his money that highly yet, of course. And so he has to go in and take a Houston job that I think to an outside observer doesn't look as sexy, but he gets the clean slate here. He gets to be kind of the legend that returns home. Sean, what do you think about Demico Ryans as far as the experience coming up here in Houston?
Well, I think it's interesting because, we've done some coach modeling, here at Sumer. Eric, you and I have done that a lot. And our modeling loved Demico Ryan. And that's interesting because you look at this, what he is working with in San Francisco and all of the players that they have there. And, you just look at that talent level and you're like, okay, well, how much can the coordinator really add? And, from what we can glean on the data side, the answer is still quite a bit. So I think that bodes really well for a Houston defense, entering the AFC South. And if you look at, who are their main competitor for that title for the foreseeable future is the Jacksonville Jaguars, right? Which the ascendants of Trevor Lawrence. So if you can bring in a guy who can build a really stout defense, and oh, by the way, you have the 2nd round pick. Now maybe you can take a shot at quarterback if you want. If you don't like this year's crop, trade back. I think there's going to be a healthy market for that. It puts you in a really good spot, both from a coaching and from a team building standpoint. And honestly, you talk about like, well, Houston's a clean slate. I think that's true, but I think that there's quite a lot going into a job like Houston, and especially if you can get the guarantees in that long-term contract that make it more attractive than a spot like Denver, because there's expectations in Denver, right? Like you come in, hey, we have the quarterback, we expected to be, on the cusp, and we were going to take down the Chiefs and all of this. It didn't work. Well, those expectations are probably still there right underneath the surface. Whereas you're coming into the AFC South at the Texans, the fan base kind of expects that we're still building. We're still trying to gear up for that upswing. And so if you come out and you have, you don't have a 11 or 12 win season as your first year at the Houston Texans, the fan base and therefore the ownership is probably a lot more forgiving than if you come out flat in a job like Indianapolis or Denver.
Well, think about that. That's a really good commentary. Where they are with management and Demico Ryans being a former player. How many years did he play there, guys? Was it 7 or I don't know?
Yeah, it was like 5 or 6. Yeah, for sure. And
very important time. Very important time for Nick Caserio, right? As a GM, it's very important for him to have not only the right coach there. I mean, he's had 2 that haven't worked out. They, interestingly enough, I believe the chronology there, or their own age, right? They were both 65 plus, weren't they? Think about this.
Yeah. Both Culley was a first-time head coach.
Yep.
Older guy, position coach guy, and then Lovie was kind of probably his last head coaching job in the league. Even we knew that before he took the job. So it was, but both older guys. Now you got a guy who's younger, and a guy who, obviously a lot of energy and a lot of probably ideas. And Thomas, do you think that this buys Caserio more years, right? Do you think, like, you look at kind of the last 2 years in Houston, they didn't look all of that like spry, even for a team that was rebuilding, because they had like veterans and they brought a lot of they brought a guy like Brandon Cooks in and all that stuff, and they looked kind of like just a team that was kind of in transition because of the Watson deal. Now the Watson deal is gone. You have all those draft picks that are associated from Cleveland. Now you can kind of, if they have a draft like Kansas City had this year with 10 guys playing in the AFC title game, like this could, and as Sean said, that division's weak. Like you could get 8-9 wins, and now all of a sudden we're all excited. And Caserio has a second wind as far as his prospects, and obviously Ryans gets some goodwill, and that could do wonders for this team.
So both of those guys, the irony of it is both George Payton and Nick Caserio, Denver and Houston, both in a situation where their first year, that really wasn't their clock really wasn't ticking that way, right? They both had situations, of course, that really they weren't ticking. As GMs, our clocks are always ticking, and they're ticking that much more in today's world than they ever were, right? Before, again, I've mentioned many times, you'd have 5 head coaches you could pick and 5 quarterbacks. You're on your way. You're making solid money. You're under the radar. In today's world, you're right there. You get 2, usually you're out. Nick's fortunate, of course, but they invested a lot in Nick. I mean, Nick is really well paid, and deservedly so. When you come from New England, people pay high for those guys, right? But I know that, back to clocks ticking, they're always going to tick with an element of urgency. There's even that much more urgency for both of these gentlemen, who I've said many, many times, not just because they're my friends. They're very good football minds. And there's a lot more involved than just being an acute football mind. It's the decisions that have to be made, and that proverbial ball has to roll your way or bounce your way, not only on decisions you make, brothers, but at so many levels. It just has to work for you. And there's going to be a lot of acute focus on both of these GMs right now, and it's open for them, right? They both. I mean, it looks to be like this is going to be a refresher. I mean, I believe this, and Nick, again, I would talk to Nick and say any day to Nick Caserio, really, really important to make sure you have the right person coming in after 2 guys that were kind of, pretty midline as far as the presence. Lovey's has his background, of course. I mean, he's won before, and you know him. It's really, really important for Nick to pair with a guy who has energy and can bring the players back in, right? The players need to want to play for an organization. They need to be behind him. They will with him, just like the people will, in Denver. That both of those organizations don't underlook or underrepresent that this locker room element is so important for them to be successful. And the way they're going to do it is with a dude at the helm. Both sides, I think, have that.
So when you talk about, the dude at the helm too, and getting the locker room involved, Thomas, can you just how much easier is it to sign free agents, right? If you have a coach who is, a player motivator or is well respected throughout the league, I think that's a huge piece of it too. If you're in Nick's shoes and you're trying to, attract some marquee free agents, that's got to be a huge factor.
It's a great point. It's a huge factor. We have places, up like Buffalo. You think, wow, how do you ever get anyone there? The weather, they're always paying a little bit more. Now they have a really good head coach and they have a really good GM, so they're attracting people. I think exactly what you're saying, Nick. Right now, a vital move for them to get the right person in there to attract free agents. You know how much negative press has been out there. It's been unfortunate. My good friend, and I know, I mean, there's situations like, I know Jack. We had Jack used to be on the show here, and people are going to throw at people in organizations. It's how it happens, and hopefully people step back when they make moves like Nick is making right now. It's really, really important for him to make sure that he cleans up what is perceived of him, right? Nick as the GM, really, really important. And again, not to continue to ramble about it, that head coach can be really, really important, regarding that, right? That's a really, really important point.
Yeah, for sure. Like there's just so much that I think that, there's just so much that goes into expectation building that I think oftentimes getting a good pair there can really sort of set expectations at a proper place. And then from there, you can have more success than, previously. Let's move on to the last guy here who got a head coaching job, and that's Frank Reich of the Indianapolis Colts. He moves on. He goes to Carolina to take over. Matt Rule was fired mid-season by David Tepper and Scott Fitterer. Frank Reich has been a guy that obviously he had a long established career in the NFL. He was a coordinator in Philadelphia when they won a Super Bowl. He had 3 winning seasons in Indianapolis, and in fact, in Indianapolis. This is another graph that we posted at Sumer Sports on Twitter if you're interested at all in that. This is the win probability added by Frank Reich since 2018 on things like 4th down decisions, 2-point conversion decisions, all of those things. And Reich, of course, for a couple of years in a row there, 2020 with Phillip Rivers, 2021 with Carson Wentz, added more than half a win to his team just by doing the right things. And some of that is our friends John Park and George Lee, who are guys who, advise him during the game. Guys he surely will have in Carolina, not necessarily exactly those guys, but, he'll bring in people to help him in game. The big issue with Reich, of course, was, the fact that, he was never able to draft a quarterback. He gets in, Andrew Luck's supposed to be his quarterback. 2018, Luck comes in and plays a really good season, gets them out of 1-5 to 10-6. They win a playoff game against Houston, and then Andrew Luck never plays again. And then he gets, Phillip Rivers into the playoffs. He gets Carson Wentz to a winning season, but it never really turns over for them. And, now Reich gets, he gets fired, and now he goes to Carolina. Does he finally get a chance to draft a quarterback, Thomas?
Yes. And with Chris Ballard, at the helm there as a GM, I mean, Chris knows that. I mean, I know a lot of, there's a lot of stuff thrown that way, right? When you got to get the quarterbacks right? You have to have the right people around you. They will dig in deep on it. I believe they can. I'm saying I'm jumping from Indy. I think he had a guy. Now he's going to Carolina, where he has Scott Fitterer, who, Scott has an understanding of that. Scott's been around the Seattle program. Scott's a good football mind and can work well with a head coach, and that's going to be vital. Now, look, one of the things we didn't talk about, it's a little complicated. I'd like to throw it over to Sean on this. It's complicated at a bigger picture, right? I mean, there's lawsuits going on left, right, and center. I saw that Matt Rule's, isn't he in the middle of a lawsuit as well? So I guess what I'm saying is he goes from one situation with Chris Ballard, who, what I was trying to take my opportunity to say, Chris is really good at what he does. And he goes from a kind of a tumultuous situation there to, he has some stuff to deal with over here in Carolina, right? He's got good people in place and an owner who's willing to pay for sure, but there's still stuff going on there, right? So that's where a true leader, you and I know this, right? We've talked about it many times, all three of us. You got to be able to adapt to that. Sean, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on with this hire, right? So you look back at what happened in Indianapolis, and there were rumors that was Wentz Reich's guy, or was this a Chris Ballard acquisition, and where does that fault lay? And so you have that mixed in, and then you come to a Carolina team that, to be quite honest, Carolina has a lot of the same problems that Indianapolis had. The quarterback situation is not settled. Maybe they get somebody in the draft, but if they don't, have the right candidate when they come up to pick, then you're either rolling the dice on someone with some known flaws that maybe you can develop, or you're rolling out, Sam Darnold again next year. Of course, they, released Baker Mayfield, who's now over with the Rams. So their options at quarterback are pretty limited. And so that strikes me as a complication to this whole thing as well. But I will say, going into the AFC South, and we look at the state of the AFC South, the Falcons had kind of an ascendant year this year, but I would say, they're probably not still there. The Bucks seem to be declining. Tom Brady's retiring. The Saints are not, I don't think, in a place to contend yet. So you look at these four teams and you're just like, gosh, if we can just get 9 wins out of the season, like, we're probably in this thing, not just as a wild card, but as the division winner.
True.
And now you're talking a home playoff game. Owners love home playoff game. There's some things outside the field that factor into that, right? When you start talking about playoff game revenue and stuff like that, and then getting the fan base excited, kind of these non-football effects. So if Reich can return to 2019 or 2020 Reich, even with a non-ideal quarterback situation, you're primed for a possible playoff push. And so that could be exciting, even if, in the back half of your mind, in the rational part of your mind, you're like, yeah, but like, to be a really good team, Carolina's probably at least, one more year away. Like, they're not going to turn into the Philadelphia Eagles overnight.
Make no mistake about it, though, before you go, because it would be irresponsible for us not to comment on the Wilkes situation. I mean, that has its own elements of how do you approach that as a coach coming in, right? With a locker room, how do you approach it with your management? How do you approach it with the fan base? That's not Frank's issue to deal with. When we came in 2008 in Atlanta after the Michael Vick debacle, people often ask me, how did you deal with that? And here's my parallel. Mike Smith and I said happened before. And of course, we worked through it, took a deep breath through it all. I remember very quickly, I had literally one of my first moves, Eric, I had to call Michael Vick at Leavenworth and tell him, hey, man, I don't know if you know who this is. It was a 30-second call. I know who you are. And I said, I just want to let you know that we're relinquishing your rights. He said, I figured that. I hope you're doing well. I hope you pull through all of this. And it was that quick. And I was thinking, my God, that was one of my very first big time calls to someone. And that's a dicey situation. Yeah. What they have in Carolina that way, it'll be interesting to navigate that and see from afar, how Steve Wilkes deals with it, right? He's coming off the edge of what's going on with the lawsuit out there, right? That is a big deal for an organization.
Yeah. And for Reich, he's got to bring those players into the fold, make them believe in what he's trying to do. And at the same time, to Thomas's point, like even if you believe that Wilkes was wronged by the Carolina organization, if that's your belief, that Frank Reich did not do that. So I think that he has to find a way to navigate that. And that's really difficult to do.
It's just a hard situation because Frank Reich's, immensely qualified for this job. Steve Wilkes, did a great job there and, is qualified as well. And so you just have to, I think we have to get to a point where, obviously there's more fairness, across the league so that when something like this happens, we don't immediately rush to, the conclusion that I think a lot of us rightfully, I think, rush to in situations like this. It's just really difficult. Go ahead, Thomas.
No, I was just going to say, look, I think it's really important to understand this. I mean, David Tepper is a big time businessman. And he does things for a reason. He's a thought out guy. He's not just doing it for the sake of doing it. Again, usually when big decisions like that are made, they're not just flippant decisions. Not sure what happened in Indianapolis or what's, during the interim time. That's a whole different story. But where we are, again, I think Carolina is a sound group. Mr. Tepper, of course, knows what he's doing. It's important. And yet we can all look at it. I've had sour grapes. When I got fired back in 20, Arthur and I get along really well. Arthur Blank, of course, the owner, and we'll still communicate now. But initially, it's a rub, and you're thinking, wait a minute, how did that happen? I'm sure Steve feels that way, and I know there's other layers to it, other people pushing him. Hopefully, again, the owner, David Tepper and Frank Reich and Scott Fitterer band together, which I'm sure they will. I'm confident of that, and they'll move on from what is potentially an issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, it's something where this situation. I mean, look, Frank Reich is a tremendous human being who many people in the league rave about as far as how he treats people and all of that, and I think that the Panthers got a really good one here. And so that, of course, is part of this discussion, which is not trivial at all. Okay, so we have just a few minutes left before Thomas, you have to go to a big important meeting, and Sean, you have to go back to your hotel. As we look at the next two jobs, right? We look at Indianapolis, we look at Arizona. Let's briefly just give maybe not a prediction, but let's, Thomas, you and I have expelled a ton of breath over these two jobs. Mm-hmm. We talked about Payton. Payton really did like the golf, and he liked the Jay Glazer aspect of Arizona. So he was really in the mix there for a while. Doesn't get that job, of course, goes to Denver. Arizona, a tough roster situation, quarterback who's hurt. The person that goes in there is going to have a lot of cleaning up to do a little bit. And then the Colts job, it looks like, Jeff Saturday is kind of the preferred guy there, which we talked about a number of times on this show. It is probably going to ruffle some people's feathers. And so let's start with the Colts. What do you guys think happens in this job search?
Go ahead.
I think Jeff Saturday gets rehired, and the reason I think that is I don't think he would be in the second round otherwise. Now, for right or wrong, we could debate that. Certainly, the Colts did not do well in the second half of their season.
Oh my goodness.
Had one win under his belt. I want to say a negative 80 point differential over the back half of the season. Struggled mightily, but that connection with the ownership group is important. And if Irsay's bought into that long term vision, then he's probably the guy. And I do know that the Colts put out the round 2 list the other day, and it was a significantly long list, but Jeff Saturday was still the first name on it.
Yeah, for sure. And that was obviously inauspicious as far as the list, of course, didn't include names like Eric Bieniemy, a guy who's been up for that job, interviewed for that job, has been up for many jobs. That was the guy on the list I was expecting to at least get a second interview, and he didn't. So that was surprising to me. Thomas, we do have to wrap up here. So let Arizona. What do you think about Arizona?
What I think about Arizona is, Monty Ossenforth and an owner there who is going to be very involved and expect a really good relationship with the head coach is going to be vital, right? And how they play that out is, again, Monty Ossenforth comes from the Patriot paradigm at one time, right? He was in New England. He understands what needs to be done as far as that relationship. So it's going to be really important for him. But he's going to ultimately have a guy, as I heard today, even though Monty's a GM, he's got an owner that's going to pick that coach, and that's going to be really important after coming away from what they just dealt with. So I'm still hung out there on my prediction in Denver, and I feel like I want to hang off of that without making a prediction in Arizona. So I'll
make
go.
a prediction
Go
in
ahead.
Arizona.
Go ahead.
I'll make a prediction in Arizona. So I think if you look at the crop of it's a lot of coordinators at this point. A lot of coordinators. The guy who made Justin Herbert look excellent and has made Jalen Hurts look excellent, Shane Steichen out of Philadelphia. I think he is the guy for Arizona. Their primary problem is quarterback. They need somebody to maximize Kyler Murray. This guy has shown with 2 different quarterbacks who played 2 extremely different styles of ball has maximized their potential. And I think that's where they go.
Well, look, we can I just say before you go there, that quarterback situation, again, we've talked a little bit about it. As a new GM, wow. I mean, Monty's a pretty even keel guy. If you guys know Monty Ossenforth, his relationship with a quarterback who's got a lot of confidence and a lot of air about him is going to be interesting in those early years. He's got a lot of money riding on it. I'm sure when Michael Bidwell pulled that all together, it was really important for him to think about the GM and who the head coach is going to be. And I guarantee it's the same thing, of course, with the head coach. Not only his ability to coach him, but again, his personality is going to be really important.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, it's tough, right? Because, you need a guy who can elevate a quarterback, and Steichen has shown to do that twice. He also is still coaching, so maybe he is the choice, he or Jonathan Gannon, and they just haven't announced it because obviously Philadelphia is in the Super Bowl with Kansas City, which they will talk about next week. Thank you all for coming to this podcast. Sean, thank you for guesting, our second guest so far. We really enjoyed this. And obviously for all of you that came along live, we thank you. Please hit the like button. Please, if you're listening to this for the first time, subscribe, rate, and review. Help us grow the podcast as we move into the off season here. So we'd love, like I said, we thank you all for joining. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Sean Clement, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 26 of the Sumer Sports Show.